Hello and welcome to another chapter of the Vermont Ridge Runner Show. Today I have two special guests with me. On my immediate right is Mr. Joe Kraus, a local attorney and an avid outdoorsman. And to Joe's right is Mike Kelley, a former Rutland native and lives in Middlebury now. And our topic for discussion and teaching and learning today is fly fishing in Vermont. And so guys, welcome to the show today. Joe.
Great to be here, Mike.
And Mike, glad you could come down. Good. We're going to pretend for a minute that I don't know anything about fly fishing, and that's not that far from the truth. So you guys are going to be teaching me a lot today too in the next half hour. But let's back up a step for a minute. Joe, let's tell us a little bit about your background and maybe a little bit about your education and so forth.
Sure. I grew up in western Pennsylvania and then Ohio. I came to Vermont in 1980 intending to visit, and I never left.
Great.
This was like the perfect place in the world for me. I love living here in Rutland. I spent all of my professional career working for Central Vermont Public Service, first as their lawyer, then running their operations. And then when the company was sold a couple of years ago, my job went away. And now I spend most of my time doing community service and doing a little fly fishing.
Great. All right, thanks. Mike, how about you?
Well, I was born in Rutland and lived here until 1974, went off to college, came back summers and all that kind of stuff. Lived in Los Angeles for a little while, but I've been here in Middlebury for I think 31 years. And I'd bird hunt, I'd fly fish, probably not as much as I used to or as much as I'd like to, but I did start that here in Rutland in about middle school.
Great. Now, are you a Rutland High or MSJ graduate?
MSJ.
MSJ, okay, good. Well, I want to thank you again for coming in. Why don't we just start out with some of the basics, and maybe you could show a little bit of some of the equipment you use, some of your fly equipment, the rods and reels, and some of the flies that you guys use.
You brought the rod.
Okay.
Sure. So let me begin by saying that if you're a fly fisherman, you couldn't live in a better place. We are blessed with an abundance of really wonderful lakes and streams filled with trout, and I think it's a hidden secret that we have such great resources available to us. So this is basically a fly rod, and the reason you need this fly rod is because we fish with these little things called flies, which are designed to look like bugs. And you want to be able to throw that a distance, and if you were just to hold it in your hand and throw it, it would go about a foot or two. So you just can't stand next to the tree throwing them in with your hand.
Right.
We have a fly rod because it's designed to take that little bug and throw it 10, 20, 30, 40, probably in Mike's case, even 50 feet.
Okay.
I couldn't cast it that far, but good casters can. So the fly rod consists of, this rod has 4 pieces. It has a reel with a fly line on it.
Okay.
And then there is an extensive piece of leader, which is usually of monofilament, and it's tied to the fly. And the goal is to cast this fly to a place where hopefully there's a trout sitting waiting for some food to come floating down the stream for it to have a meal.
Great. Thanks, Joe. And Mike, what would you like to add and maybe show some of your stuff?
Actually, I heard someone describing this once, maybe on TV or something, that when you're fishing with a regular pole, whatever you're trying to shoot out there, you have a sinker, it's got some weight, and that carries it forward. With a fly rod, what you're actually casting is the line. It's a heavier kind of a cord type thing, and that's what you end up shooting out there. The fly just sort of dangles at the end of it, and that takes some getting used to. Sometimes if you fish with nymphs or streamers and you want to get down a little bit and they've got some weight to them, it's kind of clunky. It doesn't feel right. It's apt to hit you in the back of the head when you're casting that kind of stuff. It's a little more awkward.
Now, I'm sure you guys are going to be honest on this next question, but on your back cast, you probably never hooked a leaf or branch or snapped it off somewhere, snapped that leader off for the fly.
I've sent both my children to the hospital to have hooks removed from their body. So
Seriously?
not only have I caught trees
wow.
and twigs, I've also caught my children.
The whole spectrum.
I'm not proud of that. So that's the reason very few people are willing to fish with me.
I see. You're like an equal opportunity employer.
I am, and I still regret those events. But.
Well, you're very honest, Joe.
Yeah, for me, I've hooked all kinds of things, but it's one of the reasons I started tying my flies back in middle school. I couldn't afford to lose flies.
There you go. Good. Speaking of the distances, you were talking feet, and at first I was even thinking yards, but just a little tangent here for a minute. My Uncle Bob Franzoni, who ran and owned Wilson Sports for a number of years, the 40s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s and sold it. I was a good friend of Ted Williams, a baseball slugger from Boston, and Ted would come up every year, usually around Labor Day, and then those two guys would take off for Canada and trout and salmon fish in Canada. But as a little kid, probably 7th, 8th grade, I can remember they would make a big deal out of it when Ted came to town. They'd close a section of Center Street out, the flat section, which is like even with the Paramount Theater now, and he and Ted would get out there and do fly casting demonstrations. They'd have maybe a fly with the barb and the hook cut off it, and they'd have hula hoops out there, maybe one at 15 yards, maybe one at 20 and 25 yards, and it's amazing watching them. It's just like really graceful stuff on the back cast and landing it in those different hula hoops as targets. And that always made a big impression on me. It takes a lot of coordination to do that. You're not just going to step off the sidewalk or go into the woods and become an expert right away. That's an image that always stuck out in my brain to see that.
The great thing is, in Vermont, you don't have to be able to cast a fly 50 feet.
Right.
Typically, you only have to be able to throw it 5 or 10 feet, and almost anybody can do that fishing the small streams here in Vermont, which means it's accessible. You don't have to be Ted Williams to be a successful fly fisherman.
Of course, he was an avid fisherman. Now, how about this next question on the time of the day? What's your favorite time of the day to fly fish, Joe?
My favorite time is any time.
Okay.
Most fishermen would say the best time to fish is early in the morning or late in the evening when shadows are long. But I like fishing in the middle of the day when the sun is shining and the water's sparkling in the sunshine. I probably catch fewer fish as a result, but for me, catching fish is part of the experience, but it's not the totality of the experience.
Right. Oh, that's great. Yeah. Now, Mike, how about you? What's your favorite time?
If I want to catch fish, I usually go to a smaller stream, and it doesn't seem to matter what time of day you're there doing that. But if I want to fish, and I know there are insects coming off the water, it's late in the day. And ideally for me up in Middlebury, there are a couple spots I'll go to, and not now, it's a little bit late, but in June when you've got the really, really long days, I'm apt to not get off the water till 9:45, 10 o'clock. It's dark and I'm using a light, but there's still little pops out there, and you're still trying to match up with whatever you've got in your little box with whatever they're popping for.
Yeah, could you elaborate a little more? I was going to ask you that for my next question. You're matching like the hatch of that day or the insects that are coming off the surface? Or?
Well, it's funny. You can buy books about it, but there's so much information out there now. If you go online and you look up fly hatches for the Northeast, you can look up fly hatches for Vermont. There's a couple of places around that actually have hatch charts for streams in Vermont. Orvis, I think, on their website has that kind of thing. So you can always find out what's going on there. But there are times where I can hit a stream, say from 8 to 9:30 at night, and just have great action with a fly and come back the next day, exact same conditions, nothing's changed. I haven't even taken the fly off my line, and nothing happens. And
so now it's legal to fish right through. You can fish all night long.
You can fish all night.
Yeah, in Vermont.
Yeah, I haven't done that. Never did it when I was a kid, but now, as I've gotten older and wiser, wet rocks, all that kind of stuff, I don't need to fall down doing that.
Joe, do you agree with that? You try to match some of the hatch you see there?
If I were a good fisherman, that's what I would do, but I'm not a good fisherman. So I throw things that are called attractors. They just look like a generic bug.
Okay.
And there's like 5 or 6 basics that most fishermen have. And that's usually what I do. Occasionally, if there's clear that something's interesting going on, I'll look in my box and see if I can find something similar. But that's really the exception to the rule. I usually just throw general attractor flies that look like a generic bug, and
Good.
It seems to work well for me.
I'm going to put a plug in for a minute here for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. They used to make this fishing guide and hunting guide all together in one publication, and it would fit actually into your pocket, but they've come out with 2 separate issues now. One is for hunting regs only and the other is for fishing. And for anybody just starting out fishing in Vermont, you probably want to pick one of these up when you purchase your license. There's all kinds of different regs for different bodies of water, different streams. I'm going to ask you guys in a minute if you've ever fished streams for the trophy type trout, where I think the limit in some streams is 1 or 2 fish, and that's it. Have you ever gone for the big ones before in the trophy section?
I always go for the big ones, but I typically don't fish for the trophy fish are typically stocked fish.
Right.
And lots of people love fishing for them because they're big and it's exciting. But I like fishing for wild trout, so I typically don't fish those streams, or I don't fish them for the trophy fish that have been put in them. But I know lots of people do, and it's a lot of fun.
Right. I can tell a little secret here. A couple of years ago, Joe was fishing on a little stream in Rutland County, and I'd been out running on a certain road, we'll call it Wheelerville Road, with my golden retriever pup. And as I got back to the truck, I met a mutual friend of ours, and he said, "Oh, well, Joe Kraus is down here a few hundred yards downstream fly fishing, and he's really nailing them today." So I got my pup back and hooked her up. I didn't want to startle you, and I had my running shoes on still, so I thought, well, I'll kind of be an observer here today. So I jogged down, and I could see him maybe 50 yards away, so I started tiptoeing closer and closer, and I got within maybe 10 yards, but he was really focused in. Like he said, fly fishing will do that to you. And he was, I'll be a witness here, he was catching some neat little brookies out of that stream. So that's a first-hand observation. And I don't even have to sneak in on this guy. I know he's pretty capable too. Do you ever do any pond or lake fishing, fly fishing? Have you tried that, or trolling with streamers or something of that nature?
A couple years ago, a mutual friend of both of ours, a guy named Brad Froloff, wanted to try trolling with streamers and asked me to try and tie some, and I did some on the tandem hook. And then the more he read about them, he said, well, you know, when people use them, then they stick a night crawler on it. And he said, you know, I don't waste your time tying the flies. We won't do that. But the only pond fishing I've done, it's been years and years and years. This goes kind of into the Wayback Machine in Rutland County. But kids on the street where I grew up, it was Lower East Washington Street. You try and get a ride from somebody's parents at night up to Beaver Pond, and it doesn't exist anymore. If you go up Route 4, before you climb up to Pico, there's a little place on the left. I don't know if it still has a fish and game sign there or not, but it used to be a man-made pond. And they'd stock that maybe once or twice a season, and you know, all of us kids would get dropped off up there. It'd be just full of people with bobbers out there. And the only guys catching fish would be these guys using flies, and that's kind of what got me doing it. I'd sit there and watch my bobber all night, and nothing would happen, and these guys in an hour would be back there with their 12 trout and, you know, just kind of hanging out. But I really, since Beaver Pond many years ago, and we used to get rides up to Kent Pond as well, where the brook comes into there, used to be very good. I've been up there, you know, recently, and it's filled in. It's changed quite a bit in the last 40-something years, as a lot of things have. But that's pretty much it for ponds. I'm a stream guy.
I can remember that pond you're talking about as a kid, and like you said, it's perfect for kids to go up and learn to fish or just have a blast there. But I think the deal was it was part of the Rutland City watershed, and I think they were getting a little nervous about maybe milfoil or other exotic stuff getting washed downstream into it.
That's exactly what it did have something to do with the watershed in Rutland, and the I guess outspout, I don't know what you call it, but it goes under Route 4, and there's a brook, and if you follow it down, it goes by the highway department. It's the first bridge on the Wheelerville Road if you're coming in from Route 4. So there's actually a lot of water out there. Very small stream.
So that would eventually dump into the Wheelerville Stream and Mendon Brook eventually.
Yeah.
The reservoir. Okay, good. Joe, another quick question for you. When you came to Vermont and got settled here, did you have anybody really teach you how to do this fly fishing, or did you pick it up on your own? Or?
I wasn't good enough to be self-taught, but I was fortunate. I had a colleague by the name of Jim Selleck. He was a lifelong outdoorsman in Vermont, and he had a little boat, and we would, with a small motor, we would take me out in the middle of Chittenden to practice, because I was unlikely to hook somebody else or a tree or whatever. And he was very patient with me, and despite my lack of skill, he persevered, and ultimately I learned the basics of fly fishing, and I'm forever grateful for Jim and the time he devoted to my learning the sport.
He was a good man. I knew that family. They grew up in your neighborhood too, I think, the Selecks.
Yes, East Washington Street.
East Washington, yeah, near Dana School.
That's far, that's 2 blocks away. That's a whole other world.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's true. The metropolitan area of Rutland, you could get lost there. No, that's great. I remember Jim was an avid hunter too, and Bobby Selleck, his son, was a couple of years ahead of me at Rutland High, one of his boys. But a quick story on Jim. Did he work at CV?
He did. He was an engineer.
He shot probably one of the biggest bucks in the Rutland area, maybe in the 60s, early 70s, behind Chittenden Dam toward Mount Carmel or Bloodroot. And the rack wasn't wide, but it was, you know, one of these way up, and I think it was a 16 or 17 point buck with all the different branches that came out of that thing. And he had a big picture in the Herald, you know, about it. And I remember that name. It jumped right off the page when you mentioned that name. Yeah, that's neat. Yeah. How about you, Mike? Did you pick it up on your own? Did you have anybody teach you?
I did. No. My first fly rod was bought with green stamps at that little place. It used to be on Terrell Street.
Yes.
Right by where Jones's Donuts used to be. There's a green stamp thing there. And
Yeah.
my
S&H green stamps?
But it was S&H, or are they green or blue? Whatever you got.
They were green, yeah,
Okay.
they were. Yeah, that's
My
cool.
mother used to collect them, and I got this really cheap bamboo rod in a really cheap box with a bunch of flies that were colors not found in nature anywhere. And after floundering around with those for a while, eventually you get these grizzled old, not really friendly guys at places like Beaver Pond who finally have some pity on you, and they'd show you what they were using. They'd never give you one. Nowadays, I bump into people on the stream and they'll say, "Here, take one of these things," and you'll swap flies. But these guys really didn't want to share. But took a while, and eventually you kind of learn what you need to use. There's so much information out there now, though. I mean, there's just so much more available. With us, it really was trial and error, and like. You'd go into Wilson Sports and talk to the people who were there. You'd go into Lindholm Sports and talk to the people who were there, and they'll tell you what's working.
Right. Okay, the next question I had for you was the variety of streams we have in Vermont. Now, you have things like the Batten Kill, we have Cold River nearby, Mill River. There's just tons of rivers nearby. But do you have a favorite, like, size stream, Joe, you like to fish in?
I just love fishing small mountain streams.
Okay.
And because you never know what you're going to get. Usually you get small brook trout, but it's possible you can also end up with a 20-plus inch wild brown trout. And it's that excitement of not knowing what's waiting in that next little pool in these little streams that keeps me coming back again and again.
Right,
So regardless where I'm fishing, I always just like fishing small mountain streams. That's, for me, the most exciting.
My son Kevin came up a couple of weeks ago and had a few days off. He lives in Brooklyn, works in Manhattan now, but he had a few days to enjoy Vermont again. And we took him up off the Wheelerville Road, and he used my little small, I call it my mountain or backpack, 4-piece fly rod. It's a 6-footer when you assemble it all together. And we fished some of those mountain streams you're talking about. And the tough part of that is, since Irene hit us 2 or 3 years ago in August, it's reconfigured some of the landscape. I mean, some of these streams were easy to get down to. You have trees crisscrossing them now. You have boulders in places we never saw boulders. And it's carved out some new holes too, so it's like a new section almost when you get way up into the uplands there. And so we'd enjoyed that. He did really well. We went in late one afternoon, and he was kind of matching the hatch. There was a light yellow insect that was coming off the water that day, and he wasn't having much luck until he matched his fly with that. And then he started hitting a lot. He did a lot of catch and release. Now that's my next question: catch and release, or do you release them in the frying pan occasionally, or?
I haven't. I haven't brought a fish home in forever. My mother's in a nursing home now, and she'll still, if I tell her I went fishing, she'll say, "You probably threw them back, didn't you?" I used to have to bring fish home for her when I was little, and it's funny. I've read stuff that says, they're too good a resource to keep. And I've talked to a guy who's a fish and game biologist for the state, and he said, "There's plenty of trout, don't worry about it." So I don't know. Some streams that I fish get an awful lot of pressure. If I go to the smaller streams, in the past, the wild brookies, the kind of things you're talking about like that, those guys generally don't get very big, and there are a lot of them. And I don't know, to each his own, I guess.
How about you, Joe? Do you release some, or do you catch them and keep them?
There's like 5 or 6 streams that I go to on a regular basis. I'm probably almost on a first name basis with some of these fish.
That's great.
And so I throw them all back. However, if I'm fishing a stream, typically out west where there's a super abundance of fish, we'll have fish for lunch or for dinner. So I have no problem keeping a trout and having dinner with it. But typically for the streams around here that I'm fishing on a regular basis, I always throw them back.
No, nothing wrong with that. My dad taught me how to fish and hunt and a lot of outdoor skills, but Joe Canty was his name, postal worker here in Rutland for 40 years, and he had some buddies, Pee Wee Layden, Dr. Ed Layden, and Bill Layden, which is a few generations back, the Layden boys, and they all fly fished a lot of the years you fly fish, and it was amazing, some of the fish they would catch. And they released a few, and they'd bring a few home too for the frying pan. But as a little kid, your eyes would pop out seeing the colors on those native brookies up there, the mountain stream fish. Good. A couple of other things. Mark Scott would back up what Mike said a minute ago. He's a good friend of ours, a mutual friend, and he said these upland streams have an abundance of really, really small brookies, and you're not hurting the population at all if you bring a few home. As a matter of fact, it's actually good. There's less competition sometimes for the food. in those streams. Let's leave fly fishing just for a minute. Do you ever do any spin casting or spin fishing at all too, or is it mainly fly fishing?
I love fly fishing, but I like fishing for almost anything, using anything, any equipment. So I spin cast as well. When you asked before about lake fishing, usually when I'm fishing for bass or pike, I'll use spinning rods, but occasionally a fly rod as well. So we have an array of fishing equipment in our home, depending on the time of the season or the place we're going. So I use both fly rods and spinning equipment, and whatever it takes.
Now back to when Jim Selleck taught you the ropes a little bit there at Chittenden Dam. Were you fly fishing or were you spin fishing? Or?
We were fly fishing.
Okay.
And Jim was determined that he was going to teach me how to cast a fly, even if it took the rest of his life to do it. And it darn near did, but I ultimately figured it out.
Yeah, well, look at the results. I mean, this is a lifetime type of sport and activity too, which is a great thing. That is interesting. Before we get to Mike, I'm going to ask you the same question, but since we mentioned Chittenden Dam, a lot of times after work, I'll take my Golden up and either take a little run with her and jump in to cool off, and we go out to the back spillway. And just for anybody watching the show today, if you can read above a 4th or 5th grade level, you really want to take note of this. There are big signs up there now, especially near the access areas. If fishermen are backing a canoe in or boat to go fishing on the reservoir, you really want to take notice of that. Number one is all of us in this room today help pay for the maintenance and the upkeep of these access areas. It's part of the fee when you pay for your fishing or hunting license. And so the boaters that are fishermen, to me, should get first priority. I don't have anything against kayakers or paddle, what's it called, the paddleboard people. That's fine. If you want to get exercise, that's fine. But I did say something without mentioning, I saw something about 2 weeks ago, I won't mention the warden's name, but there was a young lady up there with 3 or 4 young kids, and they didn't want to budge when a guy was trying to back his, looked like a bass boat down the ramp into the water. And I'm thinking, come on, use a little common sense. You got 3 young kids here, and a warden happened to drive in at that time. And I think he was going to go out of his way to be a nice guy and warn her, but she got right in his face, $162 ticket, and then 3 points were added, I believe, to her motor vehicle deal. So that's quite a violation. So just a word to the wise, if you see a fisherman or a boat, a canoe, anybody coming in with a kayak, just get out of their way. And the signs are very clear. Stay well away from that area. They even had some red line spray painted where the boundaries were. And outside of that, you're fine, but just stay away from these ramp areas and access areas. It's a simple rule to follow.
The financing for that, I think, goes back to the 30s, and it might be the
does.
Robertson-Pittman Act,
you're
something
right,
like that. But
yeah.
it's
39, I think.
Yeah, it's a fee that sportsmen agreed to have on. I know it's ammunition; it might be a few other things, but one of the nice things about being here in Vermont is the access you have to water and land, and the state wildlife management areas. All those boat launches that you find all over the place, that's what paid for them.
You're absolutely right. And that act that you talked about, the Pittman-Robertson Act, that's about the same time that the first federal stamp came out for migratory birds for hunting. And I can remember my dad and my Uncle Bob purchased some of them to fish or to hunt with, and then they'd buy an extra one and not sign the face. And some of those went back to the 30s and 40s that they still had. That's neat. But that's just a word of warning to the public to, heed a little bit, give a little courtesy there when fishermen are coming and going or recreational people, and give them the first right of way through there. Good. Now, Mike, on your deal with just the fly fishing, did you ever get into spin fishing much or bass fishing much?
I never did much with bass. I always kind of like catching trout because you catch them in pretty places. The water's clean, it's all that kind of stuff. And I don't have the patience to sit in a boat. I'd much rather walk and go from pool to pool. But I do have a spinning rod, bought at Wilson Sports probably 50 years ago. It's a Mitchell 300, it's metal. I don't know if they still make them, if they're still around. It still works. I did go out on Lake Champlain with some friends a couple of years ago and putter around a bit, but now I pretty much am streams and fly rods.
Okay, good. And since you mentioned spin casting and Wilson's for a minute there, I am a little biased, I guess, because my uncle owned the store for years. We have an example of a spinning rod here, and this happens to have Ted Williams' autograph on it. This was part of the line that Bob carried over at the sporting goods store. I'm not putting a plug in, even if I did, the store doesn't exist anymore, so we're not promoting one store over another. But that was a good friend of my uncle's, as I mentioned earlier. Now we're going to go to the calendar for a minute, and I'd mentioned earlier the fishing guidebook and regs will have a certain season for trout, bass, and so forth. You guys probably have it memorized. What's the opening day or weekend for trout in Vermont? Do you remember what that is?
Yep.
Oh, you have an idea, Mike? Okay.
It's, I've been looking forward to that since before puberty. It's always the second Saturday in April.
Okay, and that ends, if I'm not mistaken, late October on Halloween?
October 31st.
Okay, now are there some bodies of water in Vermont, though, that you can fish even past those
They are,
before and after?
and they're growing. And
Okay, what's that all about?
well, Otter Creek used to be, a few years ago, they made it year-round from the center of Rutland Falls north.
Oh, okay.
And I think now it's the bridge in Mount Tabor.
So all the way north to Champlain where it
Yep.
goes in? Wow.
And White River from the intersection in Bethel, I think it's the 107 bridge, to the Connecticut, I believe that's year-round. And I take my dogs out. There's some public land in Middlebury, very, very close to home. And Otter Creek around Middlebury hasn't really been fishable for most of the summer. But during the winter, we didn't have much snow this year. There were a couple of guys there, I get there 4:30, something like that. There'd maybe be half an hour of light, and there'd be a handful of guys.
Really? The real diehards?
Yep, they'd be out there, and I'd talk to them, and they'd say, well, if you get 1 or 2 a year, you're doing pretty good.
Wow.
But the conditions aren't bad. The water's clear, it's low, everything's frozen. So, but if the temperature's above freezing and you don't have high water, you'll find guys in there year-round.
So now what are the parameters, or if you're in there before the legal season opens or after, is it catch and release then?
I believe it's catch and release,
okay.
and I think it's artificials only.
Oh, okay. Huh,
And
that's
I have
interesting.
caught fish in the creek north of Center Rutland Falls through early December. But that's as far as I've gone. I don't have, woolly stuff to line waders. I don't have the gear to keep myself warm with that kind of stuff.
Okay, now the next question, you're going to have to use the honor system. But Joe, when you're out on these streams, and all of us have been through it, but have you taken some headers that are spectacular or fallen a few times?
Oh my God. Yes, as a matter of fact, I've had so many falls in remote places. My wife insisted when cell phones first came out that I get a cell phone, because she thought that using a cell phone, they'd at least be able to, one, I could perhaps call in if I was injured,
Right.
but more importantly, they could recover my body using the location devices on the cell phone. So I was completely against cell phones, and I thought this was frivolous and it wasn't going anywhere, but she insisted. She bought me a cell phone, one of the first ones, so that whenever I took a tumble and hurt myself, which happened all the time, that I would have some way to get assistance.
Great, okay. And Mike, how about you? Any spectacular headers there?
Oh,
Or like
sure.
Dick Button would call it. He used to be the Wide World Sports announcer for skating.
Figure
any
skating, yeah.
Double axles or triple sow cows before you hit a rock or the stream? Or
Yeah, I was out fishing with a guy once who fell in. The rocks were slippery and panicked. I guess it had never happened to him before. And it was in the White River. It's big, up by Bethel. And I really didn't think much of it. I kept tying my line on, and geez, he was just about to the point of asking for help. And I knew it wasn't more than 3 feet deep. All he had to do was put his feet down, but he was going down feet up. And I probably once a season, I slip, I'm over the waders, you hold the fly rod, you keep your feet up, you go downstream until you can get out a little bit. And you got wet waders and the day's probably over. But I have also driven around, I have a change of clothes now, but I have driven around with the waders in the back with not much on and things on the roof rack drying out so I could keep fishing the rest of the day.
all right, real die-hard attitude. That's great. Look at guys, we're in our final minute, but I thought I'd tie in hunting just for a minute with your fly fishing activities. I'm a real avid hunter, probably 95% hunting and 5% fishing, so I've kind of tipped the scales one way. But this is a beautiful male wood duck. I was lucky enough to get a few years ago, I brought it to a taxidermist, and the plumage on that is unbelievable. But I know that Mike ties flies, and I bet Joe's not too far away from doing it, but some of the flank feathers on that are used a lot of times when a person tying flies will use them, and I'll be glad to save a lot. Oh, great, you got one there, a sample of it.
Yep, that's exactly what that's from.
And you can see some of the flies on that. Some of the materials are from the side of a wood duck.
That's an Orvis pattern, and
Okay.
if you go online, they'll tell you what's in it. But that's a kind of a lemony wood duck flank feather to make
so
that.
came right from this area, then under the wing, then one of those feathers. And I'll be glad to save you feathers for both of you. Mallards have some good feathers for fly tying. Wood ducks, there's a variety of feathers you can use. Good. Well, as I look up at our scoreboard here, I think we're just about out of time, but I want to thank you guys again for coming in. I learned a lot today. Joe, and thanks Mike for
That was
coming
fun.
in. All right, and we hope to have you in again sometime.
Our pleasure.
Great.